Every neighborhood tells two different stories. The first is the one visitors
We
see.
need to resolve
Perfectly
this
trimmed lawns
calmly.
stretch beneath endless blue skies. Freshly painted fences line quiet streets where every mailbox looked identical. Decorative flower beds bloomed in careful symmetry, and expensive SUVs rested in spotless driveways. Children rode bicycles under watchful parents while neighbors waved politely from manicured porches. Everything looked peaceful, organized, and successful. The second story remained invisible. Behind those polished front doors lived families carrying invisible burdens, grief that never truly faded, anxiety that arrived without warning, illnesses no one could see, marriages quietly falling apart, lonely retirees who spent entire days without hearing another human voice, veterans haunted by memories they could never erase, and children trying to understand why the world suddenly felt frightening. The residents of Maple Ridge Estates understood one thing better than anyone admitted. Appearances mattered more than people. Every lawn had to measure the correct height. Trash bins disappeared before sunrise. Holiday decorations followed approved schedules. Mailbox colors matched neighborhood standards. Flowers required seasonal approval. Parking regulations filled dozens of pages. Even welcome mats had unofficial expectations. The Homeowners Association proudly called these standards protecting property values. Many residents privately called them something else. Control. No one challenged the system because challenging it always came with consequences. Letters, warnings, fines, public embarrassment. Eventually, everyone learned the same lesson. Stay quiet. Smile politely. Follow the rules. Among the hundreds of nearly identical homes lived 43-year-old Emily Carter. From the outside, Emily appeared like every other homeowner. Her grass stayed green. Her porch remained spotless. Her flower beds bloomed exactly as expected. She attended HOA meetings only when absolutely necessary. Neighbors described her as kind but reserved. Very few people knew the truth about why she rarely attended neighborhood gatherings. 5 years earlier, Emily had survived a devastating highway collision that claimed her husband's life. She survived physically. Emotionally, part of her never came home. Doctors diagnosed her with severe post-traumatic stress disorder and crippling anxiety. Crowded places overwhelmed her. Unexpected noises triggered panic attacks. Nightmares blurred into sleepless weeks. Simple errands became exhausting emotional battles. Therapy helped. Medication helped. Time helped a little. But one unexpected companion changed her life more than anything else. A gentle golden retriever named Oliver. Oliver wasn't simply a pet. He sensed panic before Emily recognized it herself. Whenever anxiety tightened around her chest, Oliver quietly leaned against her legs, grounding her before fear spiraled beyond control. When nightmares woke her trembling before sunrise, Oliver rested beside her until her breathing slowed. If she became overwhelmed in public, he gently nudged her toward exits before full panic arrived. His calm presence gave Emily something medication alone never could. Confidence. Because of Oliver, she grocery shopped again, visited parks again, returned to volunteering twice a week, even smiled more often. Her therapist often explained that emotional support animals didn't erase trauma. They simply made living with it possible. Neighbors noticed Emily seemed happier after adopting Oliver. Most assumed she had simply moved on. Only a handful understood she wasn't healed. She had simply found something helping her survive each day. Across Maple Ridge, countless residents carried their own quiet struggles. Mr. Harold Benson, a 78-year-old widower, shared every morning with his elderly cat Daisy after losing his wife of 52 years. College student Mia Hernandez managed severe depression with her rescue rabbit. Army veteran Marcus Holloway relied on his rescue shepherd after multiple overseas deployments left emotional scars invisible to everyone else. 8-year-old Noah Simmons found comfort in a small companion dog after years of bullying and social anxiety. Their animals weren't luxuries. They were lifelines. Few residents realized how many invisible battles unfolded behind beautiful front doors. Meanwhile, inside the Maple Ridge HOA clubhouse, another meeting prepared to reshape everyone's lives. HOA President Richard Hawthorne believed neighborhoods functioned best through strict discipline. Retired from corporate management, Richard approached community leadership like running a multinational company. Efficiency, compliance, uniformity. His supporters admired his confidence. Critics feared his authority. Richard viewed emotions as weakness. Rules created order. Exceptions created chaos. When several homeowners recently complained about barking dogs, pet waste, and increasing numbers of emotional support animals, Richard saw an opportunity. Not to solve individual problems, to establish absolute control. At the monthly HOA board meeting, a thick binder landed on the polished conference table. Its title read, Community Animal Policy Reform. Board members flipped through dozens of pages. Breed restrictions, weight limits, registration fees, mandatory inspections, behavior reviews. Then came the final proposal. A complete ban on all emotional support animals unless specifically classified under narrowly defined legal service animal standards. Richard described emotional support animals as a growing trend. He argued people were abusing medical exemptions. He insisted neighborhoods shouldn't become emotional sanctuaries. One board member quietly questioned whether vulnerable residents might be affected. Richard dismissed the concern immediately. If someone's emotional stability depends on an animal, perhaps they require a different living arrangement. Silence filled the room. No one challenged him again. The vote passed almost unanimously. Within days, identical white envelopes appeared in every Maple Ridge mailbox. The notice contained bold lettering. New community pet policy. Effective in 30 days. Emotional support animals no longer permitted within Maple Ridge estates. Failure to comply may result in escalating fines, legal action, and removal proceedings. The neighborhood reacted immediately. Some applauded. Others stared at the notice in disbelief. Emily read the letter 3 times. Her hands began trembling before she finished the second paragraph. Her heartbeat accelerated. Breathing shortened. Oliver immediately rested against her knees. The familiar pressure slowed her breathing just enough to avoid another panic attack. But one frightening realization echoed through her mind. They expected her to choose between her home and the companion who helped her survive. That evening, social media and neighborhood groups exploded. Some residents argued emotional support animals were fake. Others insisted rules existed for everyone. A smaller group quietly shared stories they had never spoken aloud before. Stories of grief, military trauma, autism, anxiety disorders, loneliness after losing spouses, children recovering from abuse. For the first time, neighbors realized how many invisible struggles surrounded them every single day. Emily read every message. Some offered compassion. Others accused people like her of manipulating the system. The cruelest comments hurt the most because they came from people living only streets away. People who smiled during neighborhood walks. People who waved politely from their driveways. Now they described emotional support animals as excuses. Attention-seeking. Special treatment. Emily closed her laptop. The words lingered anyway. The following morning, another envelope appeared. This one requested every homeowner disclose all animals currently living on their property. Failure to report would trigger immediate violations. The countdown had officially begun. 30 days. 30 days before families faced impossible choices. 30 days before comfort became contraband. 30 days before Maple Ridge estates would discover that some rules don't simply organize neighborhoods. They expose the true character of everyone who enforces them. Emily looked at Oliver sleeping peacefully beside the window, completely unaware that strangers had already decided he no longer belonged. For the first time since losing her husband, she felt the same crushing fear returning. Only this time, she wasn't afraid of losing someone she loved. She was afraid that people hiding behind perfectly written bylaws were preparing to take away the one reason she had finally learned how to live again. And as more homeowners quietly received medical letters, legal notices, and growing anxiety over the approaching deadline, something unexpected began to happen beneath Maple Ridge's polished surface. The silence that had protected the HOA for years was beginning to crack. For years, Maple Ridge Estates had been built on an unspoken agreement. The Homeowners Association created the rules. The residents followed them. Anyone who questioned the system usually found themselves buried beneath warning letters, fines, legal language, and endless meetings designed to wear people down rather than listen to them. That pattern had remained unchanged for nearly a decade. Until the emotional support animal ban. Unlike complaints about mailbox colors or landscaping, this policy reached into people's private lives. It forced them to reveal illnesses they had spent years hiding. It demanded explanations for invisible pain. It transformed deeply personal medical conditions into neighborhood gossip. Within a week, the atmosphere across Maple Ridge had completely changed. Neighbors still smiled politely while collecting their mail. Children still rode bicycles through quiet streets. Gardeners still trimmed hedges with perfect precision. But beneath those familiar routines, conversations were changing. Residents who had barely spoken before now lingered outside their homes. Front porch discussions lasted longer. Coffee invitations became more frequent. People who once kept their struggles secret slowly began discovering they were not alone. Emily Carter never expected to become part of any neighborhood movement. For most of her life after the accident, she had avoided attention whenever possible. Attention often meant questions. Questions often meant explaining. Explaining meant reliving memories she desperately wanted to leave behind. Yet Oliver had quietly changed more than her emotional health. He had given her enough confidence to care again. As she looked around the neighborhood, she realized dozens of other people were now facing the same impossible choice. One afternoon, she received a gentle knock at her front door. Standing outside was Harold Benson. The elderly widower held a small pie in one hand and looked unusually nervous. Everyone knew Harold. He had lived in Maple Ridge longer than almost anyone else. His wife, Margaret, had helped welcome many of the neighborhood's first families decades earlier. After Margaret passed away from cancer, Harold rarely left his home except for morning walks with his aging gray cat, Daisy, safely watching from the window whenever he returned. Emily invited him inside. They spent nearly 2 hours talking. Not about HOA rules. Not about legal notices. But about loss. Harold admitted that after his wife's death, the house had become unbearably silent. Some mornings he would accidentally prepare breakfast for two before remembering he was alone. Some evenings he caught himself turning toward an empty chair to tell Margaret about his day. Eventually his daughter brought Daisy home from a local shelter. The elderly cat didn't replace his wife. Nothing ever could. But the quiet became less painful. He had someone waiting by the door. Someone who reminded him each morning that another day was worth living. When Harold received the HOA letter, he barely slept for 3 nights. The thought of surrendering Daisy felt like losing Margaret all over again. Emily realized she wasn't hearing complaints. She was hearing grief. Over the following days, more neighbors quietly reached out. Marcus Holloway visited after work. The former Army sergeant carried himself with discipline, but years of military service had left emotional wounds few civilians ever recognized. His rescue German Shepherd, Ranger, helped interrupt flashbacks before they overwhelmed him. Without Ranger, Marcus admitted he probably would never have returned to civilian life. Then came Mia Hernandez. Only 20 years old, Mia had nearly withdrawn from college after severe depression isolated her from friends and family. Her tiny rescue rabbit had become part of the therapy plan that slowly helped rebuild her confidence. She cried halfway through explaining her situation. Emily simply listened. Then another resident arrived. And another. Within 10 days, Emily's dining room had quietly become something Maple Ridge had never experienced before. A place where people felt safe telling the truth. Nobody competed over whose struggles were worse. Nobody questioned another person's diagnosis. Nobody demanded proof. They simply listened. For many, it was the first time they realized how many invisible battles surrounded them every single day. Someone suggested organizing a petition. Another recommended contacting attorneys. Others proposed attending the next HOA meeting together. Emily remained uncertain. She had spent years avoiding confrontation. The thought of speaking publicly terrified her. But every time she looked around the room, she saw people depending on one another. Not because they wanted conflict. Because they wanted dignity. Meanwhile, inside the HOA office, Richard Hawthorne felt increasingly confident. Violation notices were already being prepared. A spreadsheet tracked every household believed to own emotional support animals. Board members congratulated one another for taking decisive action. Richard interpreted the growing neighborhood conversations as temporary resistance. He believed people always complained before eventually complying. What he failed to recognize was that something fundamentally different was happening. Fear was slowly turning into unity. The next HOA meeting became the most heavily attended gathering in Maple Ridge history. Usually fewer than 20 residents appeared. That evening, more than 100 homeowners filled every chair. Others stood against the walls. Several remained outside watching through open windows. Richard entered with the same confidence he carried into every meeting. He smiled politely, adjusted his tie, reviewed his prepared agenda. But as he looked across the room, something felt unfamiliar. People weren't avoiding eye contact anymore. They weren't sitting quietly with folded hands. They looked determined. The meeting began with landscaping updates, budget reports, road maintenance, holiday decoration reminders. Then Richard introduced the emotional support animal policy. He expected scattered objections. Instead, complete silence filled the room. The kind of silence that arrives before something important happens. Emily slowly stood. Her hands trembled. Her heart raced. For a brief moment she considered sitting back down. Then she looked toward Oliver, lying calmly beside her chair. She remembered every panic attack he had helped stop. Every sleepless night he had quietly survived beside her. Every morning he had given her strength to keep living. Without reading prepared notes, Emily spoke from memory. She explained that trauma could not always be seen. She described invisible disabilities. She described healing that happens slowly, unevenly, and differently for every individual. She never asked for sympathy. She simply reminded everyone that rules should protect communities, not punish vulnerable people. When she finished, the room remained silent. Then Harold stood. He spoke about 52 years of marriage. About empty bedrooms. About loneliness after losing the person who shaped your entire adult life. He explained that Daisy wasn't replacing his wife. She simply made surviving the silence possible. Marcus followed. He described military service without discussing classified missions or dramatic battles. Instead, he talked about ordinary sounds becoming terrifying after returning home. Car doors slamming. Fireworks. Unexpected noises. Ranger never erased those memories. He simply reminded Marcus that he was safe. Mia stood next. Then Noah's parents. Then another resident. Then another. One by one, ordinary homeowners transformed statistics into human stories. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody insulted the HOA. Nobody demanded special treatment. They shared reality. Several board members appeared visibly uncomfortable. For the first time, policy language had collided with real lives. Richard remained expressionless. When everyone finished speaking, he calmly adjusted the microphone. He thanked residents for their emotional testimonies. Then he explained that rules could not be based on feelings. Communities required consistency. Exceptions weakened standards. Policies would remain unchanged. Violation notices would begin exactly as scheduled. The room fell silent again. Not because residents had been defeated. Because they had finally seen something impossible to ignore. No amount of evidence would matter. No personal story would change leadership that had already decided compassion was less important than control. As people quietly gathered their belongings, one board member remained seated. Her name was Linda Foster. She had served on the HOA board for nearly 6 years. Usually she voted alongside Richard without much discussion. But that evening had affected her differently. She had recognized several residents she had known for years. People she had unknowingly judged without understanding their private struggles. After the meeting ended, Linda stayed behind reading the policy again. This time, she noticed something she had overlooked before. The language wasn't simply strict. It might directly conflict with federal housing protections involving disabilities and reasonable accommodations. She reread the legal references, then compared them to the documents Richard had distributed weeks earlier. Something wasn't right. For the first time since joining the board, Linda wondered whether the president had intentionally left out important legal information. Meanwhile, outside beneath the streetlights, Emily and dozens of residents gathered in the parking lot. Nobody celebrated. Nobody cried. Instead, they quietly exchanged phone numbers, created volunteer groups, shared attorney recommendations, promised to help elderly neighbors with paperwork, offered transportation for medical appointments. What had begun as fear was becoming something far more powerful. A community. Not the version described in HOA newsletters. A real one. Built on compassion instead of compliance. Across the parking lot, Richard watched from the clubhouse entrance. He believed the meeting had ended exactly as expected. Residents had spoken. The board had ruled. The matter was finished. He couldn't have been more mistaken. Because while he was preparing hundreds of violation letters, several homeowners were already preparing something much more dangerous. Evidence. And hidden inside the HOA's own records was a trail of decisions that, if uncovered, could threaten far more than a single pet policy. It could expose the way Maple Ridge had been governed for years. The morning after the HOA meeting, Maple Ridge Estates looked exactly as it always had. Sprinklers watered perfectly trimmed lawns. Neighbors drove to work. Children waited for school buses. Gardeners pruned hedges into flawless shapes. From a distance, nothing had changed. But beneath that polished surface, the neighborhood was no longer the same. For the first time in years, residents had stopped thinking of themselves as isolated homeowners. They had become a community. Instead of quietly accepting violation notices, people began working together. Emily's dining room transformed into an informal support center. Volunteers organized paperwork. Retired teachers helped elderly neighbors understand legal documents. College students created online groups to keep everyone informed. Local healthcare professionals explained the difference between emotional support animals and service animals, helping residents understand their rights and responsibilities. Nobody encouraged conflict. Their goal was simple: to be heard, to be treated fairly, and to protect neighbors who had spent years suffering in silence. As the HOA prepared its first round of fines, something unexpected happened. Linda Foster, the HOA board member who had quietly questioned the policy after the meeting, couldn't stop thinking about what she had witnessed. For 6 years, she had believed the board acted in the community's best interests. Richard Hawthorne always appeared prepared. He always spoke confidently. He always assured everyone that every decision had been carefully reviewed. But now she wasn't so certain. Late one evening, Linda returned to the HOA office to review archived meeting records. Boxes of old documents filled a storage room behind the conference hall. She wasn't searching for anything specific. She simply wanted reassurance that the emotional support animal policy had been developed properly. Instead, she discovered something troubling. Several legal opinions obtained by the HOA months earlier warned the board to avoid blanket bans on emotional support animals. The attorneys had recommended reviewing requests individually and providing reasonable accommodations when appropriate. Those recommendations had never been presented during the board vote. The board had only received Richard's summarized version. Linda continued reading. Email after email revealed the same pattern. Whenever professional advice conflicted with Richard's preferred policies, portions of those recommendations quietly disappeared from meeting packets. Nothing had been forged. Nothing had been fabricated. Important information had simply been omitted. Enough to influence votes. Enough to change decisions. enough to leave board members believing they had been fully informed when they had not. Linda felt a wave of disbelief. She hadn't merely supported unpopular policies. She had unknowingly voted without complete information. The following morning, she contacted the remaining board members individually. Not to accuse, not to argue, only to ask them to review the original legal documents before another enforcement meeting. By the end of the week, 3 board members had done exactly that. Each reached the same conclusion. The board deserved to know everything before imposing fines that could dramatically affect residents' lives. Meanwhile, violation letters finally arrived throughout Maple Ridge. Emily opened hers carefully. The notice demanded that Oliver be permanently removed from the property within 14 days or face escalating financial penalties. Similar letters appeared in Harold's mailbox. Marcus's, Mia's, Noah's family, and dozens of others. Instead of panicking, residents gathered that evening at the neighborhood park. Not for a protest, not for a rally, for support. Children played nearby while adults shared updates. Neighbors who had barely exchanged greetings a month earlier now brought homemade meals for one another. Someone organized transportation for elderly residents attending medical appointments. Others volunteered to help families complete accommodation requests supported by healthcare providers. Fear still existed, but it no longer controlled them. Word of the growing conflict slowly spread beyond Maple Ridge. A local newspaper published an article describing how the HOA's emotional support animal ban had affected residents dealing with grief, anxiety, trauma, and depression. The story didn't portray villains. It focused on people. Readers across the city recognized their own families in those experiences. Veterans, widows, cancer survivors, parents of children with disabilities, mental health professionals. Letters of support began arriving. Community organizations offered guidance. Housing advocates volunteered their time. The issue had become larger than one neighborhood. Richard dismissed the attention. He insisted the media misunderstood the policy. He reminded the board that enforcing rules required strength, not popularity. But something had changed inside the board itself. At the emergency board meeting, Linda placed 2 stacks of documents on the conference table. The first contained the legal summaries Richard had distributed. The second contained the complete legal opinions. The difference was impossible to ignore. Several board members silently compared both versions. Entire paragraphs had been excluded. Warnings had been removed. Recommendations had vanished. Nobody spoke for several minutes. Finally, one board member looked directly at Richard. He asked a simple question. Why didn't we receive all of this? Richard defended his decisions. He argued that lengthy legal documents confused volunteers. He believed simplifying information made meetings more efficient. He insisted his intentions had always been to protect property values. But the explanation no longer satisfied the room. Trust had been broken. One by one, board members acknowledged they would have voted differently had they reviewed the complete legal advice. A motion was introduced. Immediately suspend enforcement of the emotional support animal ban. Review every pending violation. Develop a policy consistent with legal guidance while still addressing legitimate concerns about irresponsible pet ownership. The vote passed. Richard cast the only opposing vote. For the first time since becoming HOA president, he found himself on the losing side. Weeks later, another neighborhood meeting filled the clubhouse. This time, the atmosphere felt entirely different. Residents weren't there to defend themselves. They were there to rebuild trust. The revised policy recognized emotional support animals through an individual accommodation process supported by appropriate documentation. Noise complaints, aggressive behavior, and sanitation concerns would still be addressed. But people would no longer lose their companions simply because someone dismissed invisible disabilities. The policy balanced responsibility with compassion, structure with humanity, rules with understanding. As the meeting concluded, Richard quietly announced his resignation as HOA president. He didn't make a dramatic speech. He simply admitted that somewhere along the way, he had begun valuing control more than community. Whether residents forgave him varied from person to person. But everyone agreed on one thing. The neighborhood could not move forward by repeating old mistakes. Months passed. Maple Ridge slowly rediscovered something it had nearly lost. Connection. Neighbors checked on one another more often. Mental health awareness events became annual traditions. The clubhouse began hosting wellness workshops alongside budget meetings. Residents volunteered to welcome new families personally instead of simply delivering rulebooks. Emily noticed the biggest change wasn't in HOA policies. It was in people. Neighbors now asked how someone was doing before commenting on their lawn. Children grew up watching adults solve disagreements through conversations instead of intimidation. The neighborhood became known less for strict enforcement and more for genuine care. One crisp autumn morning, Emily walked through the community park with Oliver beside her. The same paths that once felt frightening now felt peaceful. Harold sat on a nearby bench reading while Daisy rested comfortably inside a pet stroller designed for older cats. Marcus laughed with several neighborhood children as Ranger calmly accepted enthusiastic pats. Mia studied beneath a large oak tree, her rabbit resting quietly in a shaded enclosure beside her. The park looked ordinary, but Emily knew better. Every smiling face represented someone whose invisible struggle had finally been acknowledged. She paused beneath a maple tree whose leaves glowed gold in the morning sunlight. Months earlier, she believed she was fighting to keep one dog. Now she realized the fight had never been only about Oliver. It had been about reminding an entire community that healing rarely looks the same for everyone. Some people heal through therapy. Some through family. Some through faith. Some through time. And some because a quiet animal sits beside them during their darkest moments, asking for nothing except the chance to stay. No neighborhood rule could measure that kind of comfort. No fine could replace it. No committee could fully understand it unless they first chose compassion over assumptions. Maple Ridge never became a perfect neighborhood. Disagreements still happened. Rules still existed. Board meetings still occasionally grew tense. But one lesson remained stronger than every bylaw written afterward. Communities protect property. Great communities protect people. And in the end, the value that truly increased wasn't measured in home prices. It was measured in kindness.